Imagine standing in a field. It is early morning. The eye is cold. The grass is still wet with dew. Around you, in every direction you can see, are men, thousands of them, tens of thousands. They are frightened. Some of them are praying. Some of them are vomiting. Some of them are so young they have never kissed a woman, never owned a home, never held their own child. And they know every single one of them knows that within the next few minutes, the world as they understand it is going to end. They are alive. What happens next is so catastrophic, so complete in its destruction, that those who survive it will spend the rest of their lives trying to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. Most of them will fail. Some of them will stop trying entirely and simply carry it away without a name, a wound without a visible scar. And the official record will, in time, do something remarkable. It will look at what happened on that field, at that hour, on that particular morning in history, and it will decide that the full truth is too uncomfortable to tell. It will delete it. Not completely. History is never erased completely, but it will be minimized, reframed, buried under layers of political necessity and national mythology, until what remains in the textbooks is a shadow of the reality, a cleaned-up version, a story that keeps its bones but removes all the blood. This is about the blood. The battle we are talking about took place during the First World War, on the Western Front, in a landscape that had already been so thoroughly shelled, gassed, mined, and bled upon that it barely resembled the French countryside it had once been. The year was 1916. The place was the valley of the Somme River, in northern France. And on the morning of July 1 street of that year, at precisely jam 7:30 in the morning, the British Army launched what its commanders believed would be the decisive blow with the entire war. They were wrong about almost everything. To understand what happened that morning, to truly understand it, not just as a statistic but as a human event, you need to understand the months that came before it. You need to understand the state of the war in early 1916, the pressures that were building on every side, and the particular logic flawed, terrible, and yet in its own way completely coherent that led generals to send 100,000 men walking pache, into the guns of a prepared and waiting enemy. The Western Front, by 1916, had settled into a pattern of extraordinary, deadlocked horror. Both sides had dug themselves into elaborate systems of trenches stretching from the English Channel in the north to the Swiss border in the south, nearly 500 miles of fortified, separated in most places by no more than a few hundred yards of no man's land. The war of movement that everyone had expected in 1914 had collapsed almost immediately into something nobody had planned for and nobody quite knew how to end. Artillery pounded positions that artillery could not capture. Men were sent over the top in waves that machine guns chewed down before they had taken 20 steps. And the line barely moved. In February of 1916, the Germans launched a massive offensive at Verdun, in the French sector. Their strategy was not necessarily to capture Verdun. The town itself had limited strategic value, but to bleed the French army to the point of collapse. The German chief of staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, wrote in a memorandum that he intended to force France to commit its reserves to Verdun until France had lost more men than Germany could ever hope to lose. He called it a strategy of attrition. His word for what he intended to create at Verdun was a place where France would bleed white. He was extraordinarily successful. By the spring of 1916, Verdun had already consumed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers. The French were holding just, but the strain was enormous, and the French high command was desperate. They appealed to their British allies. They needed pressure applied elsewhere on the front. They needed the Germans to divert forces away from Verdun. They needed relief. The British had already been planning a major offensive in the Somme sector. The Verdun crisis accelerated the timetable and changed the strategic emphasis. What had been intended partly as a campaign to achieve a genuine breakthrough now took on an additional purpose, to draw German forces away from Verdun by forcing them to defend the Somme. In effect, replicate at the Somme what Falkenhayn had created at Verdun, a battle so costly that neither side could afford to walk away from it. The man given command of the British forces for the Somme offensive was General Sir Douglas Haig. He was 54 years old, a cavalry officer by training and by instinct, a man who had risen through the ranks of the British Army during an era when cavalry charges were still considered a decisive military tactic. He was not, by the standards of his time, an incompetent man. He was methodical, disciplined, and utterly certain of his own judgment in a way that would prove, in the weeks to come, to be one of the most catastrophic personality traits in the history of warfare. Haig believed that a sustained preliminary bombardment, a week-long hurricane of artillery fire targeting the German front lines, would so thoroughly destroy the enemy's defensive positions that the infantry advance on the morning of July 2 street would be, essentially, a mopping-up operation. He believed the wire would be cut. He believed the German dugouts would be destroyed. He believed the machine gun nests would be silenced. He believed his men would be able to walk, not charge across no man's land and occupy the shattered German trenches with minimal resistance. He was wrong about every single one of those beliefs. For 7 days before the assault, British artillery poured an almost incomprehensible volume of fire onto the German front lines. More than 1.5 million shells were fired during the preliminary bombardment. The noise could be heard in London, across the Channel. The air shook continuously for a week. Officers assured their men that nothing could survive that bombardment, that the Germans would be broken, that the advance on the morning of July 1 Street would be the beginning of the end of the war. But the artillery bombardment had critical failures. Many of the shells were duds. Poor quality manufacturing had produced ammunition that didn't explode on impact, that buried itself in the airs without detonating. Estimates suggest that as many as 1/3 if the shells fired during the week-long bombardment failed to explode. And crucially, the British artillery simply did not have sufficient high-explosive shells to destroy the deep German dugouts, the elaborate underground shelters that the Germans had spent 2 years constructing, tunneling sometimes 30 or 40 feet into the chalk bedrock of the Somme Valley, reinforcing with timber and concrete, stocking with food and water and ammunition, building to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment. The German soldiers went underground when the bombardment began. They sat in their deep, reinforced dugouts, listening to the world being destroyed above them, and they waited. Some of them prayed. Some of them wept. Some of them sat in the dead and played cards by candlelight while a million shells tried to reach them and largely failed. And they waited. On the night of June 30 in the early hours of July 1 Street, the British assault troops moved up into the front line trenches. There were 13 British divisions involved in the initial assault, roughly 100,000 men who would go over the top on the first morning. Many of them had never been in a major assault before. Many of them were volunteers from Kitchener's New Army, men who had enlisted in the patriotic FIFA of 1914 and 1915, who had been trained and equipped and shipped to France, who had spent months in the trenches learning the rhythms of trench warfare without yet experiencing what it felt like to actually attack. Some of the units were what became known as PALS battalions, formations recruited from the same towns, the same factories, the same football clubs and social clubs and communities. The idea had been that men would fight better alongside their friends and neighbors. Men from Bradford would fight alongside other men from Bradford. Men from Sheffield would stand next to men they had gone to school with, grown up with, known their entire lives. It had seemed, in 1914, like a sensible and even humane policy. It would prove to be something else entirely. At jam 7:28 in the morning, British engineers detonated a series of massive mines that had been tunneled beneath the German front lines over the preceding months. The explosions were among the largest man-made detonations ever recorded up to that point in history. The sound was heard in London. The airs rose and fell in enormous columns of soil and chalk and everything that had been living in it. In those areas where the mines exploded directly beneath German positions, the effect was exactly as intended, devastating and total. German soldiers were buried alive, hurled through the air, simply ceased to exist in any identifiable form. But the mines were not detonated simultaneously across the entire front. In some sectors, they were detonated early, giving the Germans precious additional minutes to emerge from their dugouts and mend their positions before the British infantry arrived. At jam 7:30 in the morning, the artillery shifted its fire from the German front lines to the positions further back, intended to prevent German reserves from moving forward. And the whistles blew. All along the British front, in a line stretching more than 15 miles, officers blew their whistles. And the men climbed up the ladders that had been cut into the walls of the trenches, and they went over the top, and they walked forward. They walked. The orders, in most sectors, were explicit. The men were not to run. They were to advance at a steady walking pace, maintaining their lines, keeping their intervals, moving forward in waves. The reasoning was that running men would lose their formation, would arrive at the German trenches disordered and unable to fight effectively. The reasoning was that the artillery bombardment had destroyed the German defenders, so there was no more need to rush. The reasoning was logical, coherent, and based on assumptions that had already collapsed before the first whistle was blown. What happened in the next hour is one of the most documented and yet somehow still almost incomprehensible episodes in military history. The German soldiers came up from their dugouts. They were shaken from the bombardment. Some of them were dazed, disoriented, ears bleeding, but they were alive. They were armed, and they had machine guns. The German army had organized its defensive positions around the machine gun with a thoroughness and tactical sophistication that the British planners had significantly underestimated. The German MG-08 machine gun, a heavy, water-cooled weapon, could fire approximately 450 rounds per minute. A single crew of 4 men could operate it. And the German defenders had positioned their machine guns not merely in the front line trenches, but in enfilading positions at angles to the line of British advance so that a single gun could sweep fire across the front of an attacking wave rather than merely shooting directly at it. As the British infantry walked forward across no more man's land, in some places across 300 yards of open ground, in other places across half a mile, the German machine gunners opened fire. What happened cannot be described as a battle in any conventional sense. A battle implies the sides in roughly equal contest, both actively fighting, both capable of affecting the outcome by their actions. What happened in those first minutes of July 1 Street, 1916, was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Men who had been walking in orderly lines simply fell, wave after wave after wave. The men in the second wave walked over the bodies of the men in the first. The men in the third wave walked over the bodies of the first and the second. In some sectors, the British troops did not even reach the German wire that the bombardment had been supposed to shoot and had, in many places, simply lifted and tangled into denser obstacles before they were chewed down. In certain areas, entire battalions were destroyed in minutes. The Newfoundland Regiment, which attacked at a place called Beaumont Hamel, suffered casualties of approximately 90% within half an hour. If the approximately 800 men who went forward, fewer than 70 returned unwounded. The rest were dead, dying, or wounded and lying in no more man's land with no more possibility of rescue. The Newfoundland Regiment achieved nothing. It captured no more ground. It inflicted no more significant casualties on the German defenders. Its sacrifice was pure, absolute, and for nothing. This story was replicated across the front with variations only in the specific details of horror. At a sector called La Boisselle, the 34th Division suffered nearly 6,000 casualties in a single morning, the highest casualties of any division on the entire front that day. At Orpheus, at Sipfel, at Serra, the story was the same. Men advancing, machine guns firing, men falling. The advance continuing because the orders said to advance, because the commanders in the rear could not see what was happening, because the communication systems of 1916 were so primitive that the information from the front took hours to reach the men who had the authority to stop the attack. And by the time the information arrived, the damage had already been done. There were places where things went better. In the southern sectors of the front, where French artillery support was more concentrated and more effective, where the German positions happened to be less formidably prepared, British and French troops achieved genuine successes. They captured ground. They reached their objectives. In those sectors, the plan, flawed as it was, partially worked, but those successes could not compensate for the catastrophe in the north and center of the line. By the end of July 1 Street, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,47 casualties. Of those, approximately 19,24 were killed outright. The remainder were wounded, many of them severely, many of them dying in the days and weeks that followed as wounds became infected in the filth of the battlefield. 57,470 casualties. In a single day, it remains to this day the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. It is, by most measures, one of the bloodiest single days of any army in the history of modern warfare. The German losses on the day were approximately 8,000 men, significant, painful, but a fraction of what the attacking force had suffered. And the battle did not end on July 1 Street. The Battle of the Somme continued for 4.5 months. From July 1 Street to November 18, 1916, both sides fought and bled and died across that stretched French countryside. The British eventually made gains measured in miles, sometimes in hundreds of yards. No technologies were introduced on the Somme. The tank made its first appearance in combat in September of 1916, lumbering forward through the mud and the wire in a wind that terrified German soldiers, but that was not yet reliable enough to change the fundamental calculus of the battle. By the time the Somme offensive was finally called off in November, the British had suffered approximately 420 casualties. The French, fighting alongside them, approximately 200. The Germans, defending, approximately 500. More than 1 million human beings had become casualties in 4.5 months of fighting over a stretch of ground that, by the battle's end, had changed hands in ways that could be measured in miles on a map. In strategic terms, the Somme achieved some of what it set out to achieve. It did relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. The Germans were forced to divert significant forces to defend against the Somme offensive, in the worst of the Verdun crisis is through the summer and autumn of 1916. In that narrow sense, the sacrifice was not entirely without purpose. But purpose, even genuine purpose, does not make the dead less dead. And this is where the story becomes not just a military history but something more troubling, something that speaks directly to how societies deal with the truths that added too painful to acknowledge. In the immediate aftermath of July 1 Street, 1916, the British government and military command faced a profound and in some ways unanswerable problem. They had sent 100,000 men forward in the most carefully planned, most extensively prepared offensive the British Army had ever launched. And in a single morning, they had suffered casualties on a scale that made almost any justification impossible to frame in language that ordinary people could accept. The official communiques issued on the evening of July 2 Street were, to put it plainly, lies. Not lies in the sense of fabricated victories. The British could not claim to have won a battle that obviously had not been won, but lies in the sense of omission, of framing, of the careful selection of which facts to emphasize and which to minimize. The communique issued to the press on the evening of July 1 Street described the attack as going very satisfactorily in many sectors. It mentioned the capture of certain objectives. It described steady progress. It did not mention 57,000 casualties. It did not describe the machine guns or the uncut wire or the men lying in rows in no man's land where they had fallen in the first 10 minutes. The newspapers, working from official communiques and in an atmosphere of wartime censorship designed to protect public morale and military operational security, reported what they were given. The British public on the morning of July 2 read about an offensive that, while costly, had achieved its objectives in many areas. They read about the gallantry of the attacking troops. They read carefully curated fragments of a reality that bore almost no more relation to the full picture. The full casualty figures were not published. Individual families received telegrams, the dreaded yellow envelopes, in the days and weeks that followed, informing them that their son or husband or brother was killed or missing. But the aggregate scale of the disaster was not communicated publicly in any direct way. The government feared, with some reason, that the full truth of what had happened on July 2 Street would be catastrophic for public morale, for the war effort, for political stability, and so began a process of management, of narrative control, that in various forms has shaped how the Somme has been remembered ever since. The generals were not widely blamed at the time, not publicly, not in any way that affected their positions or their authority. Hay continued to command the British Expeditionary Force until the end of the war. Hay was made an earl after the war ended. Hay was given a grant of £100,000 by a grateful nation. Hay died in 1928, honored, celebrated, widely regarded during his lifetime as a great commander. The revision came slowly, in the years after the war, as the survivors began to speak and write and as the scale of what had happened became impossible to deny. The war poets Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg gave literary form to experiences that official history had minimized. Their poems were not comfortable. They were not patriotic. They described a reality that sat in violent contradiction to the official narrative of noble sacrifice and necessary victory. Sassoon, in particular, made his dissent explicit. He wrote a public statement in 1917 refusing to return to the front not out of cowardice. He was quite clear about that, having won the military cross for extraordinary valor, but out of moral objection to the continuation of a war that he believed could be ended by negotiation and that was being continued by men who would never themselves have to stand in the mood of no man's land and walk forward into machine gun fire. He was nearly court-martialed. His friends arranged for him to be declared temporarily insane rather than face trial, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Scotland. The official response to dissent was, consistently, to pathologize it or to suppress it. The truth that survivors tried to tell was too dangerous to let circulate freely. In the decades that followed, the Battle of the Somme became a complex site of memory, officially commemorated, officially honored, officially described as a terrible but necessary sacrifice in the service of a just cause. The Civil Memorial, completed in 1932, bears the names of more than 72 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme and have no more known grave. It is an extraordinary monument. It is also, in its way, a monument to how official memory works, honoring the dead while carefully framing the circumstances of their deaths in language that does not too directly interrogate the decisions that produced those deaths. The commanders who ordered the assault were, in the official narrative, doing their best in an impossibly difficult situation, constrained by the technology of the time, by the strategic realities of coalition warfare, by the genuine military necessity of relieving pressure on the French at Verdun. All of these things are, to varying degrees, true. And they were used, for decades, to insulate those commanders from the harder question of whether the specific tactical decisions made on July 2 Street, the insistence on the walking advance, the excessive faith in the preliminary bombardment, the failure to adjust plans when early reports made clear that the bombardment had not achieved its goals, represented not just the limitations of the era but specific, identifiable failures of judgment that cost tens of thousands of lives that did not need to be lost. The PALS battalions bring this home in a way that statistics cannot. Because when a PALS battalion was destroyed and several of them were essentially destroyed on July 2 Street, the effect on the communities that had formed them was not just grief. It was demographic catastrophe. A town like Accrington, in Lancashire, which had raised a battalion of 520 men, friends, neighbors, brothers, sent those men forward on the morning of July 2 Street and lost 235 of them killed and 350 wounded in the space of an hour, more than 90% casualties. The survivors came home to streets where almost every family had lost someone. The wound did not heal in a generation. The Accrington PALS, the Sheffield PALS, the Leeds PALS, the Grimsby Chums, the Cambridge Battalion. Each of these formations represented a community's investment in the war effort, a collective act of patriotic volunteering, and in many cases they were fed into the machine of July 2 Street and came out the other side as something unrecognizable. The communities bore this. They had to. The alternative to acknowledge that the sacrifice had been not just costly but avoidable, not just tragic but the result of specific decisions made by specific men that could and should have been made differently was more than the social fabric of wartime Britain could sustain. And so the narrative of noble and necessary sacrifice took hold and has never fully released its grip. In the decades after the war, as the archives opened and historians began examining the documentary record with fresh eyes, a more critical assessment of the Somme began to emerge. Military historians documented the specific tactical failures of July 1 Street in detail, the inadequacy of the preliminary bombardment for its stated purpose, the known superiority of German defensive positions, the failure of battlefield communication, the specific decisions made at corps and divisional and battalion level that sent men forward in conditions that made catastrophic losses nearly inevitable. These resistments did not always reach the textbooks. The history of the Somme as taught in British schools for much of the 20th century remained largely within the framework established by official commemoration, a terrible but necessary sacrifice, the best that could be done in the circumstances, a chapter of suffering that must be honored but not too directly questioned. The critical analysis that existed in academic military history had only limited penetration into the mainstream narrative that shaped how ordinary people understood what had happened. Outside Britain, the erasure was more complete. The Battle of the Somme, which is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant military events of the 20th century, receives remarkably limited attention in the history education of most countries. The students who do not encounter it often graduate with a general sense that the First World War was terrible and involved trenches, without any specific understanding of the events that made it terrible or the decisions that shaped those events. The July 1 Street catastrophe has in recent years received more direct scrutiny. The centenary commemorations of 2016 produced significant public engagement with the history documentaries, journalism, museum exhibitions, and academic work that reach broader audiences than the specialist literature typically does. The critical reassessment, the willingness to say plainly that specific decisions caused unnecessary deaths on a massive scale, has become more mainstream. But the full accounting is still incomplete. The men who made the decisions that sent 57,000 soldiers to their deaths or wounding in a single day are still, in most official memory, described in terms that frame their failures as the understandable limitations of their era rather than as specific, identifiable culpabilities. The structural question how a military and political system permitted decisions of that catastrophic quality to be made and then protected those who made them from meaningful accountability remains inadequately examined in the popular history of the war. Because that question, taken seriously, leads to uncomfortable places. It leads to questions about how institutions protect themselves from accountability for their failures, about how official narrative manages the relationship between truth and stability, about the gap between what powerful people say and what the documentary record shows they knew, about the obligation of the present to the past. The 57,000 casualties of July 1 Street, 1916, were not abstractions. They were men. They had names. Albert Ball from Nottingham, Billy Congreve from Staffordshire, Private Albert Ingham from Rochdale, 19 years old, who walked forward into the guns at Sipful and never walked back. Captain Wilfred Neville, who famously kicked a football toward the German lines as his men went over the top, and was killed within seconds, and was posthumously celebrated for his dash and pluck in a way that somehow avoided asking why his battalion's orders had been to walk forward into prepared defensive positions. Their deaths deserve better than the half-truth that was made of them. They deserve the full story. The story that includes not just the sacrifice but the decisions that made the sacrifice necessary. Not just the valor but the machinery that consumed the valiant. Not just the memory of the dead but the accountability of those who sent them to die and then spent the rest of their careers explaining why it was unavoidable. History, when it is done honestly, is not comfortable. It does not offer the clean consolation of inevitable sacrifice and necessary suffering. It offers instead the harder, more demanding truth that things could have gone differently, that different decisions would have produced different outcomes, that the men lying in the mood of no man's land on the evening of July 1 Street, 1916, did not have to be sir. That their deaths were not written in the stars but in the plans of men who were wrong about almost everything they believed. The ground along the Somme today is green and quiet. Farmers work it. Villages have been rebuilt. The cemeteries set out of more than 200 Commonwealth War Graves commissioned cemeteries in the Somme department alone are maintained with extraordinary care. The headstones wide and regular, the grass perfectly kept. It is a landscape of grief made orderly, of loss made beautiful. But the air remembers. Farmers still turn up shells every year the iron harvest. They call it the unexploded ordnance of a war that ended over 100 years ago, still surfacing from the soil after every plowing season. And occasionally they find something else. Bones. Tags. The physical remnants of men who were never recovered, who were listed as having no more known grave, whose names are on the Sipful Memorial, who have been waiting, some of them for over a century, to be found. Every year, several sets of remains are recovered. Every year, military genealogists and DNA specialists and historians attempt to identify them. Some succeed. A name is attached to the bones. A family, 3 or 4 generations removed, is notified that their grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather has been found. They are buried with full military honors. The rifles fired, the bugle sounds, and another small piece of the truth that was taken from US on July 1 Street, 1916, is returned to the light. The battle killed 10,000 men in 1 hour. Some say more. The counting was imprecise, because the counting happened in chaos, in mood, in the aftermath of an event so large that its dimensions could not be measured in real time. What we can measure is what was done with the knowledge of it, and what was done with the knowledge of it is the reason we are still telling this story. Because the erasure was not an accident, it was a choice, and choices, in history as in life, have consequences that outlast the people who make them. The whistles blew at jam 7:30 in the morning, the men went over the top. And history has never quite stopped trying to decide what to do with what happened next.